How much of the food on your plate do you think was grown in the country where you live? Unless you're Guyana, it's not going to be 100%. I live in the UK and it produces roughly 50% of the food it consumes, which sounds pretty low, but then when you combine that with the fact that there's no large food reserves, unlike in other countries, you can see why a lot of Brits are feeling quite nervous about food availability right now.
We are criminally underprepared in terms of food security.
Where's the food? Where's the food?
This is really taking a mickey.
Like many other countries, a lot of the food that we consume in the UK comes from all over the world, via a complex supply chain over thousands of miles and across multiple industries. For a long time, this dependency was seen as efficient, but in the present-day political climate with conflicts, environmental shocks, trade wars and logistical disruptions, these choices are looking less like efficiency and more like vulnerability. You might assume that the UK, with the 5th highest GDP in the world, would rank pretty highly in terms of food security, but as we get into this, you'll see that neither wealth nor self-sufficiency are guarantees of food security. 3 main factors for defining food security, amongst others, are access, availability and stability. But getting into each of these for every country is too big for this video, so I'm going to focus on the UK because it's a particularly interesting example, and where I can I'll compare it to other countries. One really obvious way for a country to get stable access to food is to grow it for itself. So to understand why the UK grows so little of its own food, we need to go all the way back to 1815. When Napoleon Bonaparte was defeated by Britain and its allies. As Europe recovered, Britain introduced a series of tariffs on grain called the Corn Laws to stop cheaper food from coming in from outside the country. These tariffs benefited the powerful aristocratic landowners. But what happened over the next 30 years was huge political upheaval, because the Corn Laws were making food unaffordable for most people. There were divisions between the industrialists, landowners, and just ordinary workers who couldn't afford to feed themselves. This actually gave rise to the free trade movement in the 1830s. Ultimately, the industrialists won the political fight and got rid of the Corn Laws once and for all in 1846. So this was a triumph for free trade, but it was also the beginning of the decline of British farming because it enabled cheaper imported food to flow in from outside the country. And this was unique to Britain because it was the only major industrial country that was intentionally turning away from growing its own food at home. This was only made possible because of the vast reach of the British Empire. You could get grain from Canada or meats from Australia and New Zealand. To give an example, refrigerated ships in the 1880s were bringing lamb all the way from the other side of the world in New Zealand to London, where it could be sold cheaper than it could be produced in Yorkshire. And this worked well, until it didn't. In World War I, both Germany and Britain almost starved because they successfully targeted each other's shipping routes. And then in World War II, Britain almost starved again because Germany identified Britain's reliance on imported food as a strategic weakness. This shock drove the government to build up Britain's food security during and after the war by introducing rationing and boosting domestic agriculture. The intention was to rebuild production and to ensure the availability of basic supplies like flour and sugar, all part of what was called the War Book. These were big stockpiles held in government depots, and this was to prevent Britain from ever being driven to the brink of starvation again. And this was turbocharged when the UK joined the European Economic Community, because farmers were getting lots of subsidies and guaranteed prices, which encouraged high production and even bigger stockpiles, so that by the 1980s, 70 to 80% of all food consumed in Britain was produced domestically. So what went wrong? Well, these policies were becoming politically unpopular because the subsidies were driving up food prices and the intensive farming was having a big impact on the environment. So the government wound them down and started to sell off its big stockpiles of food, and then shift back to a reliance on imports. After all, the UK had access to European markets, so the logic returned. Why grow things here when you could get them cheaper elsewhere? Which is how we got to the situation today where, depending on how you measure it, Britain only produces roughly 50% of the food it consumes. As consumers, we don't always see a lack of food security, especially when shelves are well stocked and profits seem to be booming. But profits don't mean resilience. For instance, when droughts hit Spain and North Africa, prices rose. When the coronavirus pandemic hit, prices increased. When Russia invaded Ukraine, global grain markets spiked. And when the US and Israel attacked Iran, energy prices rose and fertilizer costs surged. All these are examples of how fragile the global food supply chain can be. The system did scramble to adapt, but what it exposes is a system built on efficiencies rather than resilience. To put it another way, when global trade runs smoothly, Britain eats well. When it doesn't, it can't. The fact is, countries are having to reckon with their preparedness to deal with global crises. And a big part of that, alongside social and political factors, is how much food they physically have in storage to feed their populations. Today, the UK national food reserves are down to effectively zero. The country relies almost entirely on a just-in-time system, where everything arrives exactly when it's needed. And the whole point of just-in-time is to eliminate the need for storage, and as a result there is very little static food stored anywhere in the UK. So, take London for example, with a population of 9 million, where 99% of the food comes from outside the city. At any one time, there is only 72 hours worth of food in the capital. Whereas countries such as Germany, Lithuania and Switzerland have held on to their mandatory stockpile systems. And even countries with large populations to feed, such as India and China, continue to maintain long-held storage. In fact, in 2023, India pledged to double its national stocks. Ultimately, the British food supply chain relies on an assumption that the global system will always deliver. But as history suggests, that assumption is a risky one.